with Ukraine.
We are facing an unprecedented act of aggression by the Russian leadership against a sovereign, independent country. Russia's target is not only Donbas. The target is not only Ukraine. The target is the stability in Europe and the whole of the international peace order. And we will hold President Putin accountable for that.
In other news, all remaining COVID restrictions in England end today. That means people who test positive with the virus will no longer legally have to isolate. It follows the Prime Minister's Living with COVID strategy, which also includes scrapping universal testing from April. Students starting university in September will now have to start paying back their loans as soon as they earn more than £25,000 a year. That's part of the government's response into the Augar Review, which looks into funding within higher education. The current threshold for repaying student loans is just over £27,000. TV online and DAB Plus Radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, the latest from Ukraine. Russian forces have entered from the north, south and east of the country as a full-blown invasion of Ukraine begins. There are reports of deaths at military bases as well as explosions near major cities. Just before 3 a.m. this morning, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a military operation in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. He claims he is acting in self-defense to demilitarize and extraordinarily denazify Ukraine. Putin has threatened that any outside powers who intervene will get an immediate response that will, quote, lead you to such consequences that you have never experienced in your history. Well, as civilians attempt to flee, the Ukrainian state air traffic services have closed the country's airspace due to high risk of aviation safety for civil aviation. Well, let's talk through some of the wider diplomatic context now with Keir Giles, a Russia expert with Chatham House. Welcome to the programme. We were speaking not so many days ago, Keir, where you said you believed that this was now inevitable. It must not feel all that good to be proved right.
No, that's absolutely right. And of course, it's not just me that has been proved right, but now we see the warnings that have been coming from US and the UK and the other intelligence service and open source watchers that have been watching this Russian military buildup, that it was in fact leading towards a full-scale invasion. Many didn't believe them. And of course, that includes the Europeans, who are always looking for a diplomatic way out of this problem. But now they have been proved right, and all of those warnings are coming true.
And when we look at the Europeans who've been looking for that diplomatic solution, it must be said, of course, that the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary of this country went to Moscow, but so too did the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France. I'd posit to you that all of those politicians are now looking relatively humiliated and were sort of playing Putin's game, traipsing into Moscow to only be dressed down and sent away in a grand show that really was just a sort of exercise by Putin and not gaining any gains at all.
Well, it's true that a lot of the diplomacy was futile because it was repeating the same Western messages to Russia that had already been rejected by Russia and was hearing the same complaints from Russia that make no sense in a Western context. And of course, a lot of those complaints have now been clarified by President Putin in his long speech on Monday, effectively asking for the return of the Russian Empire. But I'd make a strong exception there for Ben Wallace, the UK's Defence Secretary, who made a very different impression when he arrived in Moscow, had very clear and businesslike conversations with his Russian opposite number, and then stood out from the crowd of politicians when he was giving a press conference afterwards, being very practical and hard-headed about what exactly an invasion of Ukraine would mean and where the UK stood on that.
And what does this now mean for the UK? We're expecting a huge tranche of sanctions likely to be announced in the House of Commons later today. But what is the appetite in the West more widely for anything further? And will sanctions actually deter what many people view as someone who does not quite have control of all of his marbles in the Kremlin.
Well, it would be nice to think that the huge tranche of sanctions that have been promised will actually happen. I have to say, in the case of the UK, that will be quite a surprise, given the resistance that we've seen over the years to sanctioning Russia where it hurts, to targeting the personal fortunes of President Putin and those around him who have stolen so much from the Russian people and squirreled it away in the West, including in London. That enabler industry across London, the parasitic forces that actually feast on the funds that are coming in from Russia, have mounted such a successful resistance to actually enacting anti-money laundering legislation and then acting on it, that it will be very encouraging if we do see proper steps taken by the UK. More broadly, of course, this has to be a wake-up call to all of those countries that are arguing that actually Russia was acting in defensive motivations and that it would not move further against Europe. Now, we've seen very clearly from what President Putin has said that his ambition is not limited to Ukraine. All of the countries that formerly were under Moscow's control should now consider themselves under threat and should be preparing their defenses.
And just in our final few seconds here, briefly, if you will, where does China fit into this? We're hearing that China may well step into the game to finance Russia if they're cut off from Western financial systems.
Well, Russia has played very carefully with China and didn't want to have a repeat of the shock that they had in 2014 when they seized Crimea and didn't get the support from China that they were expecting. So there's been very intense diplomatic activity on the part of Putin trying to get China on side. Whether or not they've actually succeeded, we'll only see as the sanctions play out over the next few days.
Well, Keir Giles, expert in Russia and this sort of diplomacy, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing on this extraordinary day. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Now, we've heard some of the diplomatic news there. Let's turn to the economic. How does this affect us in our pocket domestically? I'm delighted to say Liam Halligan, GBNews economics and business editor, joins us in the studio. Now, Russia and Ukraine are huge exporters of various things. Can we go through exactly how this might affect consumers in the United Kingdom?
It seems like a distant war. It seems like diplomatic chest beating to lots of our viewers, but this will affect all of us in our pocket. This affects the financial security of our families. Russia exports huge amounts of oil and gas. It's the world's largest gas exporter. 40% of Western Europe's gas comes from Russia, and we use gas not just for cooking our egg and bacon in the morning. Gas generates electricity using turbines, and that's the really important thing, electricity. Russia also exports huge amounts of food. It's the world's largest wheat exporter. Talk to a farmer right now looking at fertiliser prices. Russia's just slapped a ban on something called potassium nitrate, the basic raw material of fertiliser. Fertiliser prices go up, and they are. Food prices go up. So again, it's particularly for lower income and more vulnerable families. They spend heavily, Tom, as you know, as we've often discussed, on food, on fuel, on heating. We already had a cost of living crisis coming down the track. We all know that fuel bills are going to go up on average by 54%. That's our utility bills in April. And we all have seen petrol and diesel prices going up on the forecourt. I'm afraid it brings me no pleasure to say this. We're going to see a lot more of that as a result of this military conflagration a long way away.
And this isn't just as a result of a particular political choice of Britain. We've seen as a response to the invasion itself, markets have been tumbling. I wonder, there are bad options for politicians. There's bad options that Boris Johnson will be assessing right now. Which would potentially be worse for UK consumers? Us slapping sanctions on Russia or avoiding the sanctions but war? Would full-scale war actually be just as bad as all those sanctions as well?
You're right. It's a bunch of bad choices. Markets are tumbling. Stock markets are tumbling. So if you're lucky enough to own stocks and shares or you've got a pension invested in markets, that's worth a lot less this morning than it was when you went to bed last night. Other kinds of markets, oil markets, the market for gold, the dollar, they're all spiking. When the world goes into shock mode, when you have panic and people are looking for safe havens, we call it, Tom, the God market. Gold, oil, the dollar, all those things go up. And of course, gold, the dollar will mean very little to lots of us here in the UK, unless we go on holiday to the States. and very few people own gold, even though lots of people talk about it. But oil affects all of us. And as you rightly indicate in your question, and I'm going to be examining this all day, and I imagine for the next weeks and months, sanctions are a two-way street. Yes, we feel that we must impose sanctions on Russia to take a stand, to try and tell Vladimir Putin that this expansionism is just not acceptable. On the other hand, sanctions will harm Western consumers, not just through oil and gas, but also food prices, as I've said, through fertilizer prices, as I've said. The Russians control vast reserves of weird-sounding metals like titanium, palladium, bauxite, which goes into aluminium. They control the market in the world for something called neon gas, which is used to create semiconductors, right? If you work in a car factory, you will know that a lot of the production lines are on go slow because there aren't enough semiconductors in the world at the moment. That was because during the pandemic, a lot of the manufacturing ended and we hadn't yet rebooted.
Yep.
But if Russia decides to really retaliate to harsh Western sanctions, this is going to become one of the major economic stories of my lifetime.
Well, Liam Halligan, thank you for running through us those very, very important issues there, issues that affect people in their pockets in this country.
And I'll talk about it more on the money at 1 p.m.
There we go. On the money, 1 p.m. on GB News, Liam Halligan's economics and business programme there. This is something that affects us, as we've heard, diplomatically, as we've heard us economically. Well, now let's talk to the political. Graham Stringer is the Labour MP for Blackley and Broughton, is a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Welcome to the programme, Graham. We were expecting the Prime Minister to come to the Commons later today. What are you expecting him to say?
I'm expecting him to say that we will give military aid to Ukraine and we will introduce serious sanctions against Ukraine. I think Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, got it right this morning when he said the original sanctions announced earlier this week was so poor that they possibly encouraged Putin to attack. He thought we weren't serious. We have to be more serious in our sanctions. And as your previous two speakers have said, that is a two-way street. And it will have some consequences for the United Kingdom and the people who live here.
Big consequences. I suppose one of those two-way streets that we heard a little bit about at Prime Minister's questions yesterday was the prospect of banning Russia Today, the Kremlin-backed television channel that peddles in false narratives from the Russian state. The worry for many is that if we were to ban Russia Today in this country, Russia would ban UK broadcasters in their country, particularly the BBC World Service that many people rely upon. Is there a worry that we may well be provoking a bigger backlash with some, not all, but some of these measures?
I suspect that debate in the Commons yesterday did Russia Today, which has a very small audience. I suspect it did them a lot of good. I don't think we should be looking at censorship now. I don't like Russia Today. It's an extraordinarily biased outlet sponsored by the Russian government. But is it going to do any serious damage? No. We're a liberal democracy. Let it put out its nonsense on a daily basis.
So that's interesting. You disagree with the sentiment of your leader and indeed the Culture Secretary on this. I wonder if potentially the political mood music in terms of banning broadcasters is shifting now.
I don't know. That's just my personal opinion. I believe in free speech. I don't believe that Russia Today is an important thing. It isn't. Letting Russia Today broadcast is not going to change the view of very many, if anybody in this country. Quite the reverse. If you can see some of their prejudice stuff they put out, it might even help things. I think we do have to do some things in this country. Stopping broadcasting isn't one of them. We have been complacent not only in not taking action when Russia has invaded Georgia and the Crimea and they've attacked us in cyberspace. We have been complacent in making sure that we have security of supply of many of the minerals and many of the issues, again, your guests have talked about. I think the policy we've had in this country of buying gas and oil from Qatar or Russia or wherever, and not using our own gas and oil supplies so that we have, it won't affect the price is determined internationally, but at least it would have given us security of supply. And I think that's true of many of the metals. We need to look to make sure in the West we have guaranteed supplies of those metals, of those materials and minerals that make our economy work. We don't have that security of supply at the moment, and that has been complacency, and we need to move in those areas. The same is true in agriculture. We have been talking within the last week in the Commons of putting over larger amounts of the countryside, not to growing our own food, but to rewilding places. Well, I'm in favour of doing everything we can to support ecology and nature, but primarily we have to make sure we can feed ourselves, and we import much food. So I think security of food, energy supplies, oil and gas and minerals is where we should be looking, because that two-way street gets more to our advantage if we can guarantee our own supplies.
Now, we're just hearing in the last few minutes that the Prime Minister will address the nation this morning. First an address to the nation and then appearing in Parliament later this afternoon. Graham Stringer, your immediate reaction to that?
Well, this is a major international crisis, and I think the Prime Minister needs to tell the country what he is thinking, what policies we're going to have. We've just been through some of those, and he certainly needs to come before the Commons and answer questions from members of Parliament. So I think that process is the right thing to do. Whether he's got it the right way round or not is a matter of procedure. I suspect he should speak to the Commons, to whom he's accountable before the nation, but that's a detail, really.
Yes, and of course he has been admonished by the Speaker in the past for going to the country before.
On a number of occasions, yeah.
Well, potentially today's events are bigger than procedure. But for now, Graham Stringer, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning, talking through this enormous story. Well, back to the wider security context of this now. I'm joined by security expert Will Geddes in the studio with us now. So we've heard diplomatically, we've heard economically, we've heard politically. Security now. Are we safe in this country?
Well, that's a big question, and it has a very, very wide spectrum of answers, Tom. It comes down to, in a visceral and physical sense, I think for the time being, absolutely we are safe. From a more technological and cyber aspect, not necessarily. We are, depending on, again, what the Prime Minister comes out with today and what he will say in his national address and subsequently what he says in Parliament, will tell us an awful lot about what level of cyber and technology attacks we will potentially be seeing. Inevitably in the Cobra meeting, GCHQ will have sat down, as will the other heads of the Cobra group, and given them their briefing of if they've seen any particularly sort of larger spikes in activities by cyber threats.
And what does this cyber threat mean to individuals in this country? Does this mean our banks being attacked, our social media accounts? I mean, what level of triviality to very serious issues are we exploring here?
Right across the board, Tom. So everything you mentioned, people are going to see, and there's already been reports of trolls, Russian-backed trolls, obviously, that are penetrating Twitter accounts. And again, it's this disinformation feed. I mean, certainly with your previous guest, you were talking about the banning of Russia today. I think it's a pointless exercise. It is paying lip service to a situation and really not making any drastic difference. Where the greater threats are, but we have super and a very effective resilience, is against, obviously, infrastructure. That is communications, that is power and electricity, that is supply chains to a certain extent. But that's not to say it's completely impervious. And anything that's made by man can be broken by man. And we always have to remember that. So in terms of the volume of attacks that potentially could come on board, People have to be particularly concerned right now about ransomware. Ransomware is one of those easiest ways to basically lock down people's systems. So people need, even just a very micro level, need to be thinking very carefully, and particularly businesses have to think very carefully about ensuring all their software is up to date, they're backing up all their capabilities and their hardware, and making sure that their data is secure. Because if they do get hit, and there's a good possibility, then that could render their business inoperable. So on a very basic level, for members of the general public, look at just making sure you've updated all your systems to the latest softwares and keep your eyes open, because inevitably the big providers of iOS, Apple products, for example, and Android products, and Macs and PCs will be launching new software and security updates in the next few days.
Very important, very, very important to state there. We'll get a security expert. Thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Well, we're rattling through these topics now. Big issue. We've heard from the diplomatic, from the political, from the economic, from the security. Let's now turn to the military. Retired Major General Tim Cross of the British Army joins me now. He was deployed on operation in both the Gulf Wars and served 3 times in the Balkans, including in Kosovo. Welcome to the programme. First of all, we're not expecting British boots on the ground in Ukraine, are we?
No, definitely not. And I don't think any other NATO forces will want to put boots on the ground in Ukraine either. The last thing we need is NATO forces closing and engaging with Russian forces in the Ukraine.
And yet we are seeing British Army troops, boots on the ground, deployed to those NATO countries in the Baltic. Indeed, quite a big presence in terms of our aircraft carrier in the Baltic Sea as well, and aircraft around the region, although not within Ukraine. Is that just a show of strength to Vladimir Putin?
Partly, but what we've actually got is we've got one battle group in Estonia just about to be reinforced with a second one, Royal Tank Regiment and the Royal Welsh Fusilier Battle Groups, with a brigade headquarters. So we're going to end up with a brigade minus in terms of land forces in the Baltics. We're also putting additional support into Romania. We have, as you say, got the Navy deployed, and the RAF are flying out of Cyprus from Akrotiri and supporting air operations over that part of the world. But we're not going to move into Ukrainian airspace or Russian airspace. The area that could cause a problem would be the Black Sea and the maritime forces, because it's a lot of these things develop into accidents and misunderstanding and so forth, and that's more likely, I think, in the Baltic, in the Black Sea than it would be in the land or air environment. Particularly as I think the current Russian intent is to secure these 2 regions that Putin has declared are part of Russia. And then at the same time, and what is happening now, is to move battalion tactical groups by sea into the Crimea and then link up the Crimea to these 2 regions. Yeah. That will secure, a significant area. It will secure, good technical areas where the equivalent of the Silicon Valley is in that part of the world. Places around Kursk and so forth.
And give it that line of coastline as well, which I believe Putin craves. Although, is there not a worry here, just finally in this conversation, that given that NATO powers are so reluctant to commit any troops, that ultimately Putin will not worry about our response?
That is true. Putin is not worried about our response. And all that we've heard about sanctions, unless the West is prepared to impose serious sanctions for a long time, and by that I mean years, then he's not worried about sanctions either. And I'm afraid that I don't think we'll do that. Germany, for one, is not going to last very long, I don't think, on this. Now, that all said, let's just put one other issue on the table. When the Russians invaded Chechnya, Chechnya had a population of 1.4 million, and the Russian land forces suffered 6,000 dead. Ukraine has a population of 44 million. So we mustn't be too despondent about this. I think Ukraine will fight. I think a lot of people in Ukraine are going to put up some reasonable resistance. They're not going to stop Russia moving into these regions or securing whatever space they want. And
we as Britain and the West can provide them with moral support, as well as arming them, as we are now. Major General Tim Cross, I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme there, but thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. Very important to get that military perspective. Now, stay with us here on GBNews for continued coverage on this developing situation in Ukraine. Patrick Christie's and Mercy Moroki are next, but first, here's the weather.
Good morning, I'm Luke Mile with your forecast. It's a cold day on Thursday. We've got snow and lightning across Scotland and Northern Ireland, and for all of us, some strong winds. Now, we've got this cold front continuing to clear its way southeastwards across the UK, so much of the country is in this blue air, cold air with strong winds, as you can see from these tightly packed isobars. So we've got some early rain clearing southern and eastern parts of England. Behind it, the colder air is sinking in, and that's where we've got the showers feeding in through the afternoon. Widely, we'll see some quite frequent snow showers across Scotland and Northern Ireland, 10 to 20 centimetres possible over the hills, combined with frequent lightning, so we have that weather warning in place. With the strong winds, we'll see blizzards over the mountains, so some really poor visibility at times. Elsewhere, plenty of sunny spells, but rattling through will be those heavy showers, some hail, some sleet and rain all in the mix, and it's a cold day. Now, we'll continue to see those showers through the first part of Thursday evening, pushing their way across the country, but tending to ease through the small hours of Friday as we start to see a ridge of high pressure in. So with clearing skies and the winds easing down, I suspect some places will have a bit of a frost as we start Friday morning. Temperatures 2s and 3s in our towns and cities, lower in the countryside. But it does mean where we have the frost in the morning, there will be a lot of sunshine around. Still a few wintry showers, perhaps down the spine of the Pennines over towards eastern England, but they should clear away. And then for most of us, it's a fine and bright afternoon with spells of sunshine, although the cloud does increase across the northwest later on with some outbreaks of rain into western Scotland. Temperatures for many places around where they should be for this stage in February, coming in around 10 or so across the south. And we keep the fine weather through much of Friday, but in towards the weekend, cloud will thicken further north. There is the chance of some rain, but it stays